The reason why narcissists never truly recover after betraying the wrong person is that they never imagined that betraying you would be the exact moment their life stopped growing. This does not happen because of karma or a desire for revenge, but because, as Carl Jung explained, the mind that refuses self-confrontation eventually collapses inward. This is not about them losing you. It is about how betraying you quietly destroyed the only chance they had to become a whole person. From a Jungian perspective, betrayal by a narcissistic personality is not a moral accident, an impulsive choice, or a momentary lack of empathy. It is a structural certainty rooted in the design of a fragmented mind. To understand why the narcissist was driven to betray you, we must abandon surface-level explanations like fear of commitment, selfishness, or even cruelty, and look into the deeper mental workings described by Carl Jung. Specifically, we must look at the relationship between the ego, the persona, the shadow, and the absent or underdeveloped self. The narcissistic individual does not possess a solid inner center, where a psychologically integrated person develops a gradual relationship with the self. As the regulating core of the mind is missing, the narcissist constructs an external substitute. This substitute is the persona, a rigid, overvalued social mask designed not merely for fitting in, but for survival. Jung described the persona as a compromise between the individual and society. But in narcissism, this compromise becomes sickly. The mask does not connect the ego to the world. It replaces it. The individual no longer knows who they are outside of admiration, validation, power, or control. Their sense of existence is conditional, sourced from the outside, and constantly unstable. You entered their life not primarily as a partner, friend, or ally, but as a psychological tool. You served as a mirror that reflected clarity, meaning, or liveliness back into an empty structure. This is not because you were weak, but because you carried something the narcissist lacked, which was inner stability. Jung would describe this as an unconscious recognition of the self in the other. However, since the narcissist cannot consciously relate to the self within themselves, they experience it as something outside, something to be owned, absorbed, or used. In the early phase, this appears as idealization. You are elevated, admired, and even worshipped, not because they see you, but because you steady their collapsing inner world. The problem begins the moment you stop functioning as a passive mirror and begin to grow into yourself. Individuation, in Jungian terms, is the process by which a person becomes psychologically whole by integrating unconscious contents, including the shadow. When you assert boundaries, develop independence, or simply remain internally consistent in the face of their manipulation, you trigger a major mental crash within the narcissist. Your consistency exposes their inconsistency. Your grounded nature highlights their fragmentation. This is not perceived consciously as being threatened, but is felt unconsciously as a fear of total destruction. Their ego, already weak, senses that the mask is cracking. At this stage, the shadow emerges. The shadow, according to Jung, contains all the aspects of the personality that the ego refuses to accept, such as envy, rage, neediness, feelings of inferiority, and shame. In a well-integrated mind, the shadow can be gradually absorbed. In a narcissistic structure, it cannot. The ego is too fragile to tolerate facing itself. Instead of integration, the narcissist relies on projection. Everything unbearable within them is pushed outward and assigned to you. Suddenly, you are the one who is selfish, cold, ungrateful, controlling, or disloyal. This psychological reversal is not a lie in their subjective experience. It is a protective delusion. Projection allows them to maintain the illusion of superiority while avoiding a mental breakdown. Betrayal is the behavioral expression of this projection. It is not merely an act against you. It is an act for the saving of the fake self. By betraying you, the narcissist symbolically breaks the mirror that reflects their own lack of worth. Jung emphasized that when the shadow is not integrated, it acts on its own, often with destructive force. The narcissist experiences this as an internal command rather than a choice. They feel driven to devalue, discard, or replace you because your presence has become unbearable. You now represent truth, and truth is deadly to a mind built on illusion. It is crucial to understand that betrayal in this context is not about desire for someone else. The third party is entirely accidental. What matters is the psychological function. They serve as a new, unthreatening mirror that can be idealized without demanding depth. The narcissist does not move toward another person. They move away from self-awareness. Betrayal is an escape route from personal growth. Jung warned that when growth is resisted, life itself turns destructive. The narcissist chooses destruction outward to avoid falling apart inward. Another critical Jungian concept here is libido, which is not merely sexual energy, but mental energy as a whole. In healthy development, libido is invested inwardly as well as outwardly, allowing reflection, meaning-making, and creativity. In narcissism, libido is almost entirely directed outward. The narcissist feeds on attention, admiration, and emotional reactions. When you withdraw emotionally, stabilize internally, or refuse to participate in their dramas, you starve this system. The loss of energy is experienced as panic. Betrayal becomes a desperate attempt to restore the flow of energy. It is not driven by pleasure. It is driven by sheer survival. This is why narcissists often betray precisely those who are most valuable to them. The more psychologically whole you are, the more dangerous you become to their internal balance. Jung noted that encounters with the self are often experienced as frightening or overwhelming. For the narcissist, you unconsciously symbolize the self they cannot access. Your presence becomes a constant reminder of their own absence. Betrayal, therefore, is not a rejection of you. It is a rejection of the self. Importantly, this process is unconscious. Asking why they did it, seeking closure, or expecting insight is useless, because insight would require an ego strength they simply do not possess. The narcissist does not know why they betrayed you in any meaningful psychological sense. They make excuses after the fact, constructing stories that preserve their self-image. Jung referred to this as ego defense. The mind rearranges reality to avoid self-judgment. The story changes, but the structure remains the same. From your side, this betrayal often feels sudden, shocking, and unfair. That is because you were relating authentically, while they were relating functionally. You assumed give and take where there was only reflection. When the mirror no longer served its function, it had to be shattered. This is not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It is the tragic logic of a mind that never developed an inner home. In Jungian depth psychology, tragedy is not caused by evil intent, but by a lack of awareness. The narcissist's betrayal is tragic because it seals their fate. By destroying the relationship that could have sparked growth, they ensure endless stagnation. Jung wrote that what we do not make conscious appears in our lives as fate. Betrayal is the narcissist's fate acted out upon you, but its consequences remain entirely with them. This reveals the central truth. The narcissist did not betray you because you were unworthy, replaceable, or naive. They betrayed you because your presence activated a mental conflict they were structurally incapable of resolving. You represented the possibility of growth. Betrayal was the only defense left to a collapsing fake self. The narcissist's greatest psychological mistake was not betraying you. Their greatest mistake was believing they understood you. From a Jungian perspective, this bad judgment is not accidental. It is deeply embedded in how a narcissistic mind perceives reality. To see why they underestimated you so deeply, we must examine the mechanics of projection, the swelling of the ego, and the narcissist's fundamental inability to recognize inner depth in another human being. What follows is an analysis not of behavior, but of perception itself, looking at how the narcissist sees, distorts, and ultimately miscalculates the soul they betray. In Jungian psychology, perception is never neutral. We do not see others as they are. We see them as our mind allows us to see them. The narcissist's mind is dominated by projection, which is a defense mechanism Jung described as the unconscious transfer of inner contents onto external objects. In healthy individuals, projection is gradually withdrawn through self-reflection. In narcissism, projection becomes permanent. The inner world is so empty and so threatening that it must be continuously pushed outward. As a result, the narcissist does not encounter people. They encounter psychological placeholders. When the narcissist first encountered you, they did not perceive your inner strength, your reflective capacity, or your hidden independence. They perceived a function. You appeared calm, empathetic, grounded, or emotionally intelligent, and these qualities were instantly taken as resources rather than recognized as signs of personal growth. In Jungian terms, they mistook your closeness to your true self for obedience, your depth for availability, and your silence for weakness. This is the narcissist's first fatal misreading. They assume that what is not aggressively defended does not exist. The narcissistic ego equates power with visibility. Loudness, dominance, emotional volatility, and control are interpreted as strength, while restraint, reflection, and inner consistency are interpreted as weakness. This is because the narcissist's ego is swollen but brittle. Jung warned that ego inflation creates a false sense of being all-powerful while simultaneously increasing vulnerability to collapse. The narcissist feels powerful only when overpowering. They cannot conceive of strength that does not require external validation. As a result, they misjudge those whose power is internal, precisely because such power does not announce itself. Your presence activated a dangerous illusion in them that you needed them more than they needed you. They looked at your patience and mistook it for submission. They looked at your capacity to forgive and mistook it for a lack of boundaries. They looked at your emotional investment in the connection and mistook it for dependence. They believed that because they held the cards in terms of manipulation, guilt, and unpredictability, you were entirely under their control. They built their entire strategy of betrayal on this fundamental miscalculation. They thought that when they discarded you or betrayed you with someone else, you would break down, chase them, beg for validation, and prove their theory that you were weak. When you did not do that, when you instead withdrew quietly, saw through the illusion, and maintained your dignity, their internal world began to fracture. They did not expect you to have an inner foundation that could survive their absence. They assumed that without them, you would disintegrate because they believed they were the source of your stability. Discovering that you could stand alone without them was not just surprising to them, it was terrifying. It proved the falseness of their entire worldview. It demonstrated that their grandiosity was an empty shell and that real strength belonged to the person they had just discarded. This realization is too catastrophic for a narcissistic ego to process consciously. Instead of admitting their mistake, instead of recognizing your true depth, and instead of taking accountability for their destructive choice, they double down on the delusion. They rewrite history to convince themselves that you were never that important in the first place, or that you forced them into their actions through some hidden offense. This circular loop keeps them trapped in a prison of their own making. They continue moving from person to person, seeking a mirror that will flatter them without ever challenging them, running away from the shadow that follows them everywhere. They leave a trail of broken connections behind them, convinced each time that the problem was the other person, completely blind to the fact that the common denominator in every single failure is their own refusal to look inward. You moved forward because your growth was real, and while the betrayal caused pain, it ultimately freed you from a dynamic that was holding you back. The narcissist, on the other hand, stayed behind in the ruins of their own projection, forever searching for a reflection that will never be able to save them from themselves. This belief is not arrogance in the conventional sense. It is a perceptual distortion born of projection. The narcissist projected their own dependency onto you because they require external mirrors to exist psychologically. They assume you do as well because they fall apart without attention. They assume you will collapse without them. This is why narcissists often behave with reckless confidence during betrayal. They are convinced that you will remain emotionally anchored to them, orbiting their absence, desperate for closure or validation. Jung described this mechanism as unconscious identification. The narcissist identifies you with the parts of themselves they cannot tolerate. Your emotional depth becomes neediness. Your loyalty becomes attachment. Your introspection becomes passivity. This distortion allows them to feel superior while simultaneously justifying abandonment. They believe they are moving forward while you are being left behind, when in fact, the opposite psychological path is unfolding. Another crucial factor in their bad judgment is the narcissist's inability to perceive the self in another person. In Jungian theory, recognition of the self in others requires prior contact with the self within oneself. Because the narcissist has not undergone personal growth, the self remains unconscious, feared, or entirely absent from their inner landscape. As a result, when they encounter someone who is closer to the self, they cannot recognize it as independence or wholeness. They interpret it as emotional detachment or lack of dependency. This misunderstanding is disastrous. You were not bonded to them through dependency. You were bonded through choice. You were not attached because you feared abandonment. You were present because you were integrated enough to remain.